Okay, so you get the concept of the duty of loyalty, which is to be loyal to the long-term success of the school. But are you aware of some of the subtle yet persuasive and often unconscious ways in which your thinking can be influenced? In this video, we explore some ways in which trustees can be influenced, oftentimes through innocent or unconscious means, and in your quest to be loyal to the long term of the school, the strategies that can be employed that help avoid cognitive bias. Okay, that all sounds a little bit dark and confusing, so let me give you an example. Not related to boards, but one that perhaps illustrates how your thinking can be directed, and not always down the right path. And to do that, I'm going to use some basic high school mathematics and basic algebra. Okay, so you're familiar with algebra, representing variables using letters. So we'll just keep things simple, and we'll just use an A and a B. And let's assume that they have the same value, so A equals B. Now we know from our mathematics lessons that basically what we do to one side of an equation, we have to do to the other. In this case, I want to multiply both sides of the equation by A. So A squared equals AB. Again, what I do to one side of the equation, I must do to the other. So I'm going to subtract B squared from both sides. Therefore, A squared minus B squared equals AB minus B squared. Now, you may recall from your high school mathematics that the left-hand side now is referred to as the difference between two squares, which can be factorized as A plus B, A minus B. And the right-hand side both has B in common, to both terms, so you can also take B out as a factor, leaving B bracket A minus B. If you're not convinced by this difference between two squares, we can check it by multiplying out the brackets. So A times A is A squared, A times minus B is minus AB, B times A, AB, so one subtracts from the other, leaving with nothing, and then finally B times minus B is B squared, leaving A squared minus B squared. Now looking at this equation, we can see that there's an A minus B on both sides of the equation, so surely they cancel each other out, which leaves A plus B on one side, B on the other. Since A equals B, replace the A with a B, so we now have B plus B equals B, or 2B equals B, so 2 equals 1. My guess is that other than being a bit confused by having to remember some of your high school algebra, you may also be a bit dumbfounded by the realization that I've just proven that 2 is equal to 1. Clearly that can't be right. Yet all of the steps would appear to be logical and mathematically sound. And the thing is that oftentimes on the board, it's possible that your thinking gets influenced by the procedures and discussions without you really knowing about it, because it all seems to kind of make sense. Watch through to the end of the video and I'll explain where I've hidden a mistake in my mathematical logic that leads to the impossibility of 2 equals to 1. So I may be stating the obvious when I say that no one really likes to be wrong. Whether at home, at work, or around the board table, we base our opinions on the model of the world that we've built over the years. And I say model of the world because that's basically how the brain works. It can't remember every little detail from each and every action and encounter we have. And so working models are built in the brain that gives us mental shortcuts or generalizations that help us deal with the world in which we live. Being wrong somehow means that we've a poor model that's led to an incorrect decision, much like my proof that 2 is equal to 1. And that's generally not easy to accept, that the models that are the foundation for your world are incorrect. And so quite often people will defend their position quite vigorously so as not to be wrong, so their model of the world is still valid. There's also a type of cognitive bias called a Dunning-Kruger effect, where it's quite common for people to overestimate their ability, which can be more apparent in low-skilled people who often don't possess actually the skills required to recognize their own incompetence. And the combination of poor self-awareness and low cognitive ability leads them to overestimate their abilities. Charles Darwin actually wrote in his book The Descent of Man, ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. Or in other words, fools are blinded to their own foolishness. Perhaps you know someone in your work or family that begins spouting off on a topic at length, boldly proclaiming that he's correct, and everybody else's opinion is uninformed. And yet it may be plainly evident to everyone in the room that this person actually has no idea what he or she is talking about, yet he continues completely oblivious to his own ignorance. David Dunning summarized this when he said, "Instead, the incompetent are often blessed with an inappropriate confidence, buoyed by something that feels to them like knowledge," and suggested that the very trouble with ignorance is that it can feel just like expertise. So let's face it, we don't like being wrong. Think about how many times you've been in a heated debate and thought to yourself, if you knew what I knew, then surely you would agree with me. This could be thought of as the ignorance assumption, and that when you know what I know, you would draw the same conclusions as me. And then, having explained the situation as best you can, the other person still doesn't agree with you. That leads to the idiot assumption, that knowing now what I know, you still choose to reach another conclusion. That must mean that you have something missing upstairs. You're an idiot. And of course, if you know what I know, and yet it's evident that you're otherwise smart, that only leaves one alternative, that you're purposely trying to argue with me. The evil assumption. So considering that we don't really see ourselves as being ignorant, an idiot, or evil, only tends to want to prove our position, that we don't want to admit that we're wrong. And this stubborn approach is part of the loss aversion bias that often shapes our behavior. Being wrong feels like a loss, and we often take ownership of an idea and fight for it more than it's actually worth. Taking a step back from the situation to reflect on the concepts and information can be very difficult. The brain's also hardwired to make comparisons, especially when we have to make a decision, which can lead to a disproportionate weight being attributed to things that simply just because they can be measured and compared. So let's say you have to look at a new school for your children, and one school has got a 98% pass rate, and another school has only a 75% pass rate for examinations. While these measures could be very misleading and don't tell the whole story, they may easily sit and fester in your unconscious when having to make a decision. Advertising gurus also know this fact too well and present customers with a sense of choice, knowing that they're going to send you down a certain path. Often this is known as the decoy effect, and research shows that when there's only two options, people will tend to make a decision based on their personal preferences. But when they're offered another strategically placed decoy option, they'll be more likely to choose the more expensive of the two original options. So let's take an example where customers were offered a bucket of popcorn. So a bucket of popcorn was $3 or a large one for $7. Most of the people in the analysis bought the small bucket. But when a decoy option was added, a medium bucket for $6.50, most consumers actually chose the large bucket. So given that we are comforted by this confidence, what we need to do is ensure that our thinking is actually sound. And there's a couple of techniques that can help us. And the first is to focus on what knowledge is felt like a gut impression and what knowledge comes from empirical testing. The second is to practice suspending your normal approach, to suspend your forms of logic and to think playfully from different perspectives. Research indicates that the best decisions occur when people take time to study the decision-making process itself and not just the decision. So as trustees, where decisions are made for the interest of the school, it's helpful to really understand the basis of the decision-making process itself, so you can remain independent in your thinking. So maybe there's an opportunity to split into groups to discuss issues, or actually check with other trustees to explain a decision that has to be made, and to stop and ask yourself, what might I be missing? Is this empirical or is this just a gut feel? And finally, in this very brief exploration of cognitive bias, is the anchor bias. And this happens typically when the information is first planted when a discussion starts. Just as I started with my proof of 2 = 1, I anchored a certain thought process, a pattern at an unconscious level that's very hard to pull away from. You might like to think about conversations in a board meeting you've had, and you may reflect that they were dominated by certain individuals, or the discussion went down a certain path, but after the meeting you had so many thoughts that you wish you'd shared. Quite often, the first person to speak on an issue in a board meeting sets a position, an anchor, and conversation is then likely to follow in a sequential manner. It's human nature to find it easier and more comfortable to seek confirmation than to look for counter-evidence. How often would you straight out disagree with something that's been said, but would rather try to bring your point out through hoping to convince others around the table of your opinion? So often there can be a natural drift towards groupthink where there's a failure to consider the alternatives as a way of unconsciously preserving that group harmony. This can lead to a failure to seek information that may contradict the group view, or a failure to use information. You only see what you're looking for, or indeed a failure to use information where the unconscious drivers is to be accepted in the group, and they make us dwell on common information rather than paying attention to those alternative viewpoints. Again, splitting the board into groups for discussion that feeds back can help this. Often each group comes up with a slightly different outcome, which can be valuable. Or you could suggest a silent start or a silent finish to spend a couple of minutes independently thinking about the pressing issues and jot down the ideas or questions on a sticky note. And finally, if you are starting a topic of discussion, think about how you could ask questions to help frame the issue rather than making a statement or opinion. Asking questions can be very effective at ensuring that everybody's working from the same set of assumptions and criteria for the decision-making process. Are there any strategies that you think might work for you that help you to protect the independence of your thinking process? Okay, I know you're curious as to how 2 is equal to 1. All of the mathematical steps were correct except for one. And you may be thinking it comes from the complex factorization of a squared minus b squared, but you'd be wrong. That's perfectly sound. What you didn't realize perhaps, maybe because I slipped it in after something complex, was the seemingly simple step of cancelling a minus b from both sides of the equation. If a equals b, then a minus b is 0. So the process of cancelling from both sides requires you to divide by 0 on both sides. Dividing by 0 is undefined, and this is where we have this major mathematical error taking place.